The news is talking about David Gale, a former philosophy professor who was sentenced to capital punishment by the Supreme Court. He is accused of taking the life of his university colleague, Constance Haraway. This case has garnered public attention because David and Constance were activists for the abolition of capital punishment for prisoners. Journalists are determined to secure an interview with him at any cost before the sentence is carried out. They have only 4 days left. David Gale's lawyer agreed to speak only with the journalist Bitsy Bloom. This isn't the first time she has interviewed an inmate. Now Bitsy has to uncover the truth from the lies. However, the boss sent Bitsy with one condition: she would have an intern with her. Bitsy is not thrilled about it because she's used to working alone. On the way to Texas, Bitsy and the intern Zach Stemmen studied the case materials. Gale's guilt was fully proven because his fingerprints and DNA were found at the crime scene. Zach is convinced that there's something wrong with this story. Gale is an intelligent man, and that doesn't fit with the carelessness shown in the crime. The car stalled, so the journalists had to stop. But the worst part is that there is no signal here. When Zach went to the restroom, Bitsy noticed a suspicious cowboy in a pickup truck who was clearly following them. The first day came. The journalists stayed at a motel. Zach spent the morning reading a book authored by David Gale. Apparently, he was a genius in the field of philosophy. Bitsy makes it clear to Zach that this is her interview. Her reputation is the reason they're here. The journalists continued their journey. Zach noticed that in these parts, there are more prisons than churches. They arrived at the county prison. A guard gave them passes and led to the administrative building. Duke Grover, the head of the Texas Department of Justice, explained that 442 inmates are awaiting execution here. Visitors are not allowed to bring phones, cash or other items. Duke Grover then took the journalists to a visitation room, where Braxton Bellew, Mr. Gale's lawyer, was waiting for them. David himself was already here. Strict discipline is enforced in the prison, so a convict is not even allowed to stand. The lawyer explained that only one journalist can be present, and recording devices are not allowed. Zach tried to object, but Bitsy didn't mind conducting the interview on her own. When everyone else left, David made it clear that he wouldn't answer questions about his wife or son. He only wanted to tell what had really happened. David also understands that most people see him as a criminal, not a person, but he believes Bitsy is different. Recently, she ended up in jail for refusing to cooperate with an investigation because she wouldn't reveal certain facts about a criminal after an interview. Bitsy said that defending an informant, even if they are a bad person, is her professional duty. David began telling his story from the very beginning. He was the dean of the philosophy faculty at the University of Austin. He lectured to students and was popular among them for his sense of humor and unconventional approach. On that day, Berlin, a student with poor grades, arrived late for the lecture. After the class, she approached the professor and hinted that she was willing to do anything to pass the exam. However, such offers did not interest David. David and his colleague Constance were actively involved in a campaign to abolish the capital punishment for prisoners. They were preparing for upcoming debates together. In the evening, David wished his son Jamie a good night. His wife wouldn't be back from Spain for another 4 days. In David's absence, a nanny was looking after Jamie while his father was getting ready for a party. Berlin was also at the party. She was on the verge of expulsion and still hoped to negotiate with the dean. However, David remained firm in his principles. Throughout the party, Berlin stayed close to David. Everyone was very drunk, including him. When David went to the restroom, Berlin followed him and closed the door. She said she was no longer a student, so they didn't have to follow the rules at all. David tried to convince her that it was not a good idea, but Berlin was very persistent. All night long, the guests danced and had fun. The next morning, David was hungover and could barely comprehend Constance's words. She was determined to prove that several people in the state had been wrongfully sentenced. Constance realized that something else was bothering her colleague. David confessed that he had made a terrible mistake the previous night. Constance immediately guessed that it had to do with one of the students. Of course, this upset Constance. She believed that David had acted unprofessionally, but it had nothing to do with their cause. David later appeared on television. His opponent in the debate was a prominent politician. David was convinced that thoughts of punishment would never deter criminals, but the governor disagreed. According to him, severe crimes should be punished with the highest penalty. That's the price of justice. David openly mocked the governor and constantly interrupted him. In contrast, the governor remained calm and asked David to name specific individuals who had been wrongly convicted. David had nothing to reply. Constance, who was watching the debate, was dissatisfied. It was a complete failure. The next day, Constance expressed her displeasure to David, accusing him of selfishness. Apparently he wanted publicity, not victory, while Constance did all the work. Their conversation was interrupted by police officers who arrested David. In the present, David told Bitsy that Berlin had accused him of unacceptable actions. She did it as a form of revenge for her expulsion. After some time, Berlin withdrew the complaint to make it look like she was having a hard time participating in the trial. David's reputation was irreparably damaged. Afterward, Berlin moved to San Francisco. Bitsy wanted to learn more details, but the interview time was up. Bitsy tasked Zach with finding out as much as possible. She wants to be certain whether David is telling the truth. For now, Bitsy doesn't believe a word of David's story and considers him guilty of both crimes. The journalists are unaware that the cowboy in the pickup truck has been continuing to follow them. The second day arrived. The journalists visited a museum dedicated to David Gale's gruesome crime. It used to be extremely popular, but now it was nearly deserted. This was where David Gale committed his crime. After learning the horrifying details of that fateful day, Zach was perplexed. Bitsy was equally shocked. Suddenly she noticed a pickup truck parked next to their car. Later, Bitsy conducted a second interview with David, who claimed that someone had framed him. David also believed that there was a video recording of the crime. Bitsy remained skeptical of David's claims of innocence. He meanwhile continued his story. After Berlin withdrew her complaint from the police, David was released, but his wife took their son and was going to leave. David tried to change her mind, but of course she would not forgive him for that. Later, David read a farewell email from Sharon, who stated that she wanted a divorce and to sell the house. Constance visited David and expressed her regrets about what had happened. Officially David was still employed at the university, but the administration insisted on his dismissal. David put the house up for sale. All this time he tried to call Sharon, but she had not left any of her contact information. David was searching for a new job, but due to his reputation no employer wanted to hire him. No scientific publications or other achievements could rectify the situation. David began to have problems with alcohol. He often behaved inappropriately in public. It seemed like there was no way out. David's alcohol problems worsened, while he kept trying to reach Sharon. When David met with his lawyer, he was told that the chances of winning the case were almost non-existent. Sharon would get full custody of their son if David didn't quit his destructive habits and get his life together soon. David made the decision to attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. After some time, he went for an interview for a managerial position. Constance was working when she heard a knock on the door. David stood on the doorstep. Constance was genuinely glad to see that her friend was recovering from his depression. Constance had a close friend, Dusty Wright, who always wore a cowboy hat. He was also aligned with her in the movement against the capital punishment. One day while out on the street, David approached some of his former students to greet them. However, they hurriedly left. But that was far from the worst part. On the same day, David was fired because the company that had hired him faced criticism. Constance really wanted to help her friend but didn't know how. David relapsed and started drinking again. He was in tears trying to call Sharon to speak to their son, whom he hadn't heard from in a long time. Just when life started to improve, everything fell apart again. The only place David could always go was Constance's house. She was the only one who hadn't turned her back on him. Suddenly, while opening an envelope with a letter, Constance lost consciousness. A frightened David called an ambulance and accompanied his friend to the hospital. Nobody knew what had happened to Constance. David remained at the hospital, awaiting news. Finally, a doctor approached and said that people with leukemia react very sensitively to stress. David had no idea that his friend was ill. In the present, David couldn't hold back his tears. He had become so absorbed in his own problems that he hadn't noticed the changes in Constance. She knew she had little time left. So Constance strived to do everything she could to help others avoid the same fate. The interview ended. Later, Bitsy learned from Zach that Braxton Bellew, David's lawyer, had acted very incompetently during the trial. He could have negotiated a reduced sentence but didn't take advantage of the opportunity. The journalists returned to the motel. They had $500,000 in cash with them, which should be handed over to Bellew shortly. Bitsy found the door to her room open. Clearly someone had been here. Inside, the journalists found a cassette intended for Bitsy Bloom. They went to Zach's room and played the cassette. The video showed the last moments of Constance's life, but the perpetrator did not reveal his face. It took Bitsy a long time to recover from what she had seen. Instead of calling the police, the journalists decided to give the cassette directly to Bellew. The third day arrived. Over breakfast, the journalists contemplated their next steps. Even if Gale was innocent, it was very difficult to secure a review of a guilty verdict in the state of Texas. Perhaps someone is purposefully ruining Gale's life by first ruining his reputation and then setting him up. The cowboy in the pickup truck continues to follow the journalists everywhere. Zach wanted to write down the license plate number but didn't manage to. Later, Bellew said that it was challenging for him to force himself to watch the cassette to the end. He is convinced that David is innocent. Within half an hour, the lawyer intends to file an appeal. While Zach was examining the case materials, Bitsy was preparing for the third meeting with David. Suddenly she noticed the cowboy in the lobby. It was Dusty Wright. Bitsy asked Zach to follow the cowboy and find out as much information about him as possible. That's exactly what Zach did. He followed Dusty's pickup for a long time, but the cowboy managed to break away from the chase. Meanwhile, David tells Bitsy about Dusty Wright, who was the leader of their local movement before Constance. He is stubborn and fanatical, believing that demonstrations and active protests are the way to get things done. Dusty was expelled from the organization, but Constance helped him get back in. He adored her. Dusty also testified against David in court. Meanwhile, David continued his story, recalling how at a rally, he and Constance had called for valuing every life. However, not everyone shared their humanitarian stance. After the rally, Constance cried, unable to understand how people could be so cruel in their desire for revenge. Meanwhile, David tried to reach his wife again. Constance sat beside him, looking pained. She still couldn't come to terms with her illness, as she had many plans for the future. The only regret Constance had was that she had never paid attention to her personal life. And now it was probably too late. David hinted that he could help her with this. At first Constance thought he was joking, but David was dead serious. It was that night when everything between them happened. In the morning, David woke up on the lawn next to the neighboring house. Soon after, Dusty arrived at Constance's place. David spent the entire evening in his car, drinking. Soon he was arrested by the police. Bitsy is convinced that the real culprit is Dusty Wright, but she doesn't have time to prove it. David only wants Bitsy to save the memory of him for the son. His own life no longer matters to him. The third interview came to an end. Tomorrow David's sentence will be carried out. Bitsy has only one day to prevent it. Without wasting any time, Bitsy and Zach met with Bellew, who informed them that the judge had rejected the appeal. The court considered that the video recording proved nothing because it didn't show the perpetrator's face. Bitsy spent the entire night studying the case materials. The fourth day arrived. David was escorted to the place where his sentence would soon be carried out. Waking up in the morning, Bitsy saw a towel Zach had thrown on the bathroom floor. It gave her an idea. The journalists arrived at the same museum to accurately reconstruct the events of that fateful night. Meanwhile, Bellew informed David that the person responsible for carrying out sentences had given the green light. Bitsy had an epiphany. She realized that Constance had voluntarily left her life, setting it up as if it were a crime. To avoid leaving fingerprints, Constance likely wore gloves and then removed it. If it had been a criminal, they would have discarded the gloves, just like Zach left the towel. But it was neatly folded. It's a typical habit of a homemaker. Zach considers it nonsense, but Bitsy disagrees with him. Constance staged the crime, knowing full well that someone innocent would be arrested. She did it to prove a point, that anyone innocent could be wrongfully sentenced to capital punishment. Presumably, Dusty helped Constance carry out her plan. It was he who anonymously delivered the cassette to the journalists, providing undeniable evidence of David's innocence. Bitsy and Zach kept an eye on Dusty's cabin. He had the full version of the video. Dusty planned to release the recording after the execution to trigger a more significant public outcry. Soon Dusty received a phone call. Zach had set up a meeting for him at a gas station. It was actually a decoy to lure Dusty out of the house. Dozens of journalists gathered near the prison. Everyone was curious about how David Gale would spend the last hours of his life. Waiting for Dusty to leave, Bitsy sneaked into his cabin and began searching for the required cassette while Zach waited at the gas station. Bitsy checked each cassette, and finally she found what she was looking for. Dusty had recorded Constance voluntarily giving up her life for their common cause. Bitsy couldn't watch it without tears. Zach arrived and hurried Bitsy away. It turned out that Dusty didn't show up at the meeting. He had been watching the journalists all this time but didn't interfere. On the way, Zach started making calls to the Supreme Court and other authorities. Meanwhile, David was being escorted out of his cell. Time was running out. Besides, the engine stalled. Bitsy got out of the car and started running, hoping to make it in time. Activists had gathered near the prison building. Half of them were in favor of the capital punishment, and the other half were against it. Bitsy didn't make it in time. Upon learning that the sentence had been carried out, she burst into tears. An innocent man had been deprived of his life. Dusty was proud because he had fulfilled his duty. Meanwhile, Bellew arrived at the airport with the money. When the cassette was made public, it sparked public outrage. Meanwhile, Bellew met Dusty in the restroom, handing him the money, a ticket and a passport. It turns out Bellew had been aware of everything from the very beginning. Despite all efforts, the authorities refused to cancel the capital punishment. According to the authorities, one mistake does not prove anything. Dusty arrived in Italy, where Sharon lives, and left the briefcase with money under her door. After some time, Bitsy received a package. David had asked the lawyer to send Bitsy his son's favorite toy in advance. It was supposed to be her key to freedom. Inside the toy, there was another cassette. When Bitsy played it, she realized that David had also been aware of everything and had participated in this plan alongside Constance, Dusty, and Bellew. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.